Sergeant First Class L. E. Grube, serial number 21669, 36th Aero Squadron. German Kaiser Wilhelm and General von Mackensen inspecting a French cannon they had captured in their drive on Paris. One of my little friends at Kazak's Lake. Part of our convoy of 15 ships off Halifax headed for Europe, escorted by British warship HM8 Roxbury. We were on the British ship Pannonia, 1,800 of us, packed in like sardines. This is a device dragged behind the ship to tell the ship's speed. These pictures are the storm we hit in the North Atlantic. It was the worst storm the sailors had ever seen in their years at sea. Our first early winter home at Camp Isodun. Wet blankets on wet straw on wet ground. In fact, we were all wet. Some of the first planes that I worked on, we started out with a cultivated farm and built it into an airport before the airplanes could be brought in. Camp Isodun, as we built it, some tents and some wooden barracks. At that time, I was in the construction squadron of the Air Service. While in Isodun, I was transferred to a service squadron and moved to an aero gunnery training camp at Kazak's Lake, south of Bordeaux. The black crosses mark the graves of 1,200 Russian soldiers who came to help the French. In a riot, they were machine gunned by the French in 1917. Cemetery is near Kazak's Lake Camp. Our barracks at Kazak's Lake Camp. An Algerian helper. We had hundreds of them and animates at our camp. They did a lot of fighting among themselves, mostly with knives. A standard camp toilet where you got a good view of the scenery, and those that were part of the scenery got a good view of you. The women who did our washing were often a part of the scenery. Track and road back of our camp where our recruits and supplies come in at Kazak's Lake Field. French diggers at work. Artillery target area at Cournot near our camp. Finished the trenches. A plane to be salvaged that landed in the woods. The pine trees were brought in from USA years ago to stop the sand dunes along the coast from moving in and covering up the farms, miles and miles along the coast. Barracks at the edge of flying field at Kazakh's Lake. About a mile across the field were the hangars where I worked. The job that I and my crew did was to build new planes from parts that were manufactured in France and US. Also, if wrecked planes were not too badly damaged, we rebuilt them into flyable planes. These are some of the samples of what they gave us to work on. These wreck pictures were all taken at Kazakh's Lake and St. Jean du Mont aerial gunnery training fields. The Cauldron bomber wreck killed the entire French crew, landed very close to a hangar where I worked as well. A U.S. Liberty on taking off hit an officer's toilet and tipped it over on the door. 2 pilots inside got out by crawling through the seat holes, unhurt except dignity wrecked. One of these pilots found the plane standing on its nose in the middle of his room. The pilot of the plane was proud of his bullseye. Crashed into the lake. Divers brought up part of the plane. The body of the pilot was never found. The wreck, right close to my repair hangar, landed so hard that the pilot's head was severed and rolled off to the side. That plane was never rebuilt. Our hydroplane camp at Kazakh's Lake. I never worked there, but I did get a ride over it in my first and only plane ride while in France. Unauthorized flying was forbidden, and a person's insurance was canceled while he was on a joyride. I had to bribe a French pilot with Bull Durham tobacco to get my one ride. The outline of the plane was a target for diving fighter planes. The cauldron dragging a target, which could be a couple of 100 feet behind the plane, on the firing line. The score for the fighter plane pilot was determined by the number of bullet holes he put into the target. He often put holes in the towing plane, but they were not included in the score. The target holes were patched before the next pilot had a chance at it. And there it is there. A 400 horsepower motor boat used as a rescue boat for lake crashes could make 65 miles an hour. Target makers, and patchers. Floating target tenders. Machine gunners shooting at balloon targets. Shooting at distant floating targets. Lake. It will soon be sunrise in the US of A. Our 4th of July 1918 celebration at Kazakh's Lake. Competitive sports for the US, French, and Annamites. No scores were kept or prizes awarded. Line of Newport fighters. These are the type of planes that I helped to build new and rebuild when they were messed up. This is a British AR. Our first US Liberty plane. More French Newports. A Leotard airplane. This was captured from the Germans, a Rompler with a Mercedes motor. It was the only plane on our field that a single person could crank it up, climb into the cockpit, and fly away. The Mercedes motor was so quiet that the Germans used them for spying behind our lines. There were no battery starters for starting up the motors in those days. The pilot would be in the plane with his hand on the throttle, and the landing wheels would be blocked so that the plane would not run over the starter, or the starter would get a hold of the propeller, tip it, and give it a good hard yank. 2 to 4 fellows would have hold of the starter to pull him away, otherwise the propeller would pull him in and take off an arm or his head. The pilot would then throttle the motor down to a reasonable speed, and the blocks would be removed in front of the wheels, and away the plane would go. twin-motor cauldrons used primarily for towing targets. This is the type of plane that I took my one and only joyride in. I rode in the front of the cockpit, which was not covered, and the propeller tips were so close that I could have reached out and touched them. I didn't have a helmet, so I had to remove my hat and glasses, or they would have landed in Bordeaux or Paris. A visitor from the French dirigible camp. They were used along the coast for spotting and bombing submarines. They had twin motors and carried about a dozen French sailors. Target balloons, both captive and free, flying that pilots in fighter planes and machine gunners on the ground used as targets. It was easy to count the gunner's score, as all the holes had to be patched before they were sent up again. I guess they were too explosive to use girl patchers. They can hardly wait for ice cream to freeze. This was squad project, 8 men, and the other 157 of the squadron were not in this party. The best looking soldier in the U.S. Army, with field glasses, ready for a hike. A letter writer at work. A newspaper from home, also an airing day for the blankets. Ready for a trip into town. A Scottish soldier dropped in to call on Bruce Wayneman, up in the upper left, a U.S. Scotsman. Before the war, Bruce was one of the big baritone soloists of New York City. He had a contract to return to his old job as soon as the war was over. Two sergeants ready to leave for pilot training, both flunked because of too much liquor and women. A girl sent the boys a supply of cigarettes. This picture was sent to her. Ready to start on extended camp leave. Spotting bomb shots. Waiting for chow call. About ready to start for Letest Village, Letest. The Liberty being fueled up. Some of our hangars at the edge of the flying field. On the 1 mile trek from the barracks to the work hangars, a 4 times a day experience on work days. German prisoners playing a game, something like football. Camp helpers from North Africa. Building more barracks for more soldiers. A never-ending job. Line up for passes. Got the passes now. Waiting for trucks headed for town. Tents that are typical of those we lived in at many different times. A squadron packed and waiting for the train. It's coming. All aboard and ready for another camp. Slow, but quite sure transportation system. Perfectly okay for short distance, and these folks in their lifetime never got far from home. Threshing buckwheat with flails. Quite a bit of the grain is lost. Threshing wheat mechanically, women do most of the work. They carried the wheat from the stacks to the machine by hand. Both French and U.S. soldiers enjoyed seeing how it was done. Women washing their clothes, and ours, the hard way in the canal near the Kazakh's lake. Very old woman working her field. The water in the furrows is not irrigation. It is excess water left by a rainy season. The natives, all dressed for church. This is standard transportation. Some are very heavy loads for a 2-wheel cart at a small village near our camp at Kazakh's lake. Hotel de France at La Teste, where I stopped at night when I couldn't get a ride back to camp while on leave. Clean beds and simple but good food. Dad, the YMCA secretary, and his young fans. The little chap on the extreme left had also adopted me. The language barrier was no problem for him and me, as a piece of candy or a pat on the head is the same in all languages. My home for the night at Hotel de France. The feather comfort on the bed is the warmest thing possible on a cold night and is very light. I think this was Sunday school picnic. One of our soldier boys got in on the picture. A couple of homes in Arcachon. Pictures taken in Arcachon, which is considered one of the choice seaside summer resorts of France. The beach was grand and the city very beautiful. None of those noisy and rowdy attractions like one sees at Revere Beach and Coney Island. Got in a couple of trips to Arcachon while at Kazak's Lake. Spent 2 days in Paris on a AWOL. Luckily I did not get caught. This is a long-range gun that was used by the Germans to shell Paris that had just been captured. It was permanently mounted on a railroad truck and could be let down and fastened to a concrete base when it was put into action. The French were moving it to the Invalides, a monster building in which a museum similar to the National Museum of Smithsonian Institute in D.C. I went through the Palace of Versailles, but there were so many guards around that picture taking wasn't possible. Go out in the Royal Gardens, I took a couple. This is a view of Paris taken from partway up the Eiffel Tower. The area in the Eiffel Tower above was locked off against visitors. There's a small island in the River Seine in which stands the original of our Statue of Liberty. It is not over 100 feet tall, but made me think that I was back in New York Harbor. Here's a group of pictures taken in the French Alps where I spent 10 days on vacation in September of 1918. Hotel Savory, where I ate and slept. This is a group of the hotel people who saw to it that our vacation was a success. Shady place for women to do the family washing on one of the main streets. An open air provision market. Back in Aix-les-Bains, Mount Rivard in the distance. It is one of the highest of the French Alps and is very beautiful from any angle. Mount Rivard in the distance with a rare glimpse of Lake Bourget, the largest lake in all of France. The donut-shaped loaf of bread that the little girl is carrying is usually carried on the handlebars of a bike. It is never wrapped in paper. It was whole wheat, and oh boy did it taste good. This is the first four-wheel wagon that I saw in France. The owner must have been a plutocrat. The water carving at the chasms near Aix-les-Bains was very interesting. This picture was taken in a cave with the camera pointing straight up. This is the start of another cave. The chasms reminded me of the Lost River in New Hampshire, only it was larger. Cog Railroad, up Mount Rivard for the non-mountain climbing individuals. Bike riders that were out for a hazardous thrill took their bikes up on the train and coasted their bikes over 7 miles over a steep and winding road to the base. There were so many serious accidents that The stunt was generally discouraged. I ended up my climb at the cliff directly over the fence post in the foreground. There were several miles of climbing between the fence post and the cliff. In the immediate foreground is a cliff at the top of Mount Rivard. In the distance is Mount Chat. From the top of Mount Rivard, we get a grand view of Mount Blanc, which was about 40 miles away, over in Switzerland. In the niches were buried the remains of 70 Savoy kings. During the past hundreds of years, the ownership of this Savoy district has changed hands many times. Casks of wine, acres of them, quite near the docks, ready for shipment all over the world to those who are thirsty. One of the many monuments that grace the Bordeaux squares and parks. Bordeaux, from the highest spot I could find, it is a very busy and also very crowded city. The Notre Dame Cathedral, the architecture of this building is very interesting. One of the ancient Roman ruins, the Roman masons were as good as any we have today. Notre Dame Cathedral Guard. Soldiers and sailors at the Bordeaux railway station. A urinal in the center of one of the main squares of Thurs. Very handy for those in need. Getting back onto our freight cars after a bit of airing at Thurs on our way back to Saint-Jean-de-Mont. Inside of one of the freight cars, good for 8 horses or 40 men. The horses would not be so crowded as they did not take any baggage along. Village scenes in Calones. Stone houses, stone walls, stone roads. They will be here 100 years from now. The only possible addition will be lamp posts. A gab fest in the main square before going into church. Our boys had nothing else to do as they were on leave, so they just helped swell the crowd. Sunday church crowd at little town of Notre Dame. If you wanted to sit down at church service, you took your own chair or stool with you. Another Sunday, another church congregation, this time at Saint-Jean-de-Mont. Most of our leaves away from camp were on Sundays, and Sundays the villagers all went to church. During the week, they were also at the work grind. One of our St. Jean washwomen and her family. Hard work makes them look much older than they really are. You would think that these are her grandchildren and not her own children. A member of the St. Jean transportation system. Two groups of St. Jean folks, all dressed up, even to their polished wooden shoes, with the usual scattering of our troops sandwiched in. Firewood trees. The French are not permitted to chop down a tree, they just top them, which makes them branch out. The larger branches can be cut off for firewood. Not a bad idea at all. We had used trees in the background for rifle targets. A week later, some of the trees had fallen down. Too many bullseye on a tree was just the same as sawing them off. A typical French farm. The top of the dirt walls was used as sidewalls during the rainy season. A portable steam engine, very crude, but still able to do the work of several persons. Women, I'll bet. Windmills that turned out whole wheat flour that made the most delicious bread one ever tasted. A long pole off to one side was used to move the windmill around to face the wind. The trouble was that windmills were put on high ground where the houses should have been. The wet season is on. It's not for a couple of days, it lasts for weeks. At times, we wondered how we have to last longer than the rainy season did. Some of the people in the flooding area had small boats, which they propelled by standing up and pushing the boat along with a long pole. Not much speed, but quite sure. Typical rural homes. Dirt floors, whitewashed, mud or stone walls, thatched roofs, few and tiny windows, fireplace heat, table made of plank supported by stakes driven into the floor. If they have a barn, it is usually attached to the house. The best piece of furniture in the house is usually the bed. We Americans should be so grateful for what we have. Picturesque view behind the barracks. Barrels of water being brought into camp by mule power. It's a lousy picture, and the water is just as lousy. The drinking water they doped with chloride of lime. Much short of that, they doped it with iodine. A chap that was not too popular because he blew the bugle that we all hated. We got up to the bugle, ate our meals by the bugle, lined up for work, for inspections, for going to bed, and for dozens of other things by the bugle. The French, the German prisoners, and the U.S. blew taps one after another. On clear cold nights, I would lay there and really enjoy it. The French taps was rather glum, but the German and ours would really give you a thrilling good night. Our officers were all dressed up for a march we were about to do. The instruments were also ready. By the way, the bugler did not come home on Manchuria with us. We had to leave him in the vulnerable stockade of St. Nazaire. Chris, a mongrel dog that adopted our squadron. He hated the Frenchmen and would bark at them whenever they got within seeing or smelling distance. We brought him back to America with us. He went home with one of our boys. The sailors of the Manchuria had a bulldog for a mascot, and Chris beat him up so badly that they had to keep their bulldog below deck to save him. Our mess hall at St. Jean. Line up for venereal inspection, which were very frequent affairs. 26 of our boys were in the hospital at one time from our squadron with syphilis, one of them from our medical staff. Our hotel type bunk after we removed the upper bunks. Equipment inspection. If the inspectors found that you had latched on to too many of anything, like blankets, they would return the excess to the quartermaster. Rather a heartless idea. Company Street during the wet season. It was too deep for wading through and too shallow for swimming. grave and funeral procession of our squadron commander, Lieutenant Bailey. He had been married only 1 week before he left for France. I sent some of these pictures home to his wife. There were only about 20 graves in the St. Jean Cemetery at the time, December 4th, 1918. About 2 months later, you can see how fast we were losing our pilots in training and their trainers. The 2 hangars where my gang built the fuselages, or bodies, and rebuilt those that had been salvaged from crashes. Another gang of mine at the wing and tail hangar. The motor test group, who worked under another sergeant, were at St. Jean Field. Within minutes after our monthly payoff, crap games and poker would start up and would continue until the losers were dead broke and the winners had no one else to play with. The French washwomen delivering our laundry in the rain at the edge of camp. They never kept any records, and I never heard of laundry being delivered to the wrong person. The Hotel de la Plage at St. Jean, near the beach, where our squadron celebrated Christmas dinner 1918. It was surely a grand meal. Even Chris thought so. Right after Christmas dinner, which was about the same as the folks in America had, except we had roast chicken instead of turkey. Chris had been convinced that there was live animal in that hole and wanted it. He had forgotten that he was plumb full of roast chicken. Planes out of the repair shop, waiting for a bit of sunshine, and a few eager pilots. The Spad plane with Hispanic Switzer motor. Till the American Liberty came on the scene, the Spad was the only plane that could take a couple of captured German planes that were used for targets by our fighter planes. The motors and other parts had been removed for our research men to examine for new ideas. 27 U.S. Liberties lined up for their picture. The Liberties did a grand job. But it was too bad that we did not have them a year earlier. Planes other than Liberties also lined up for their picture. While I was taking these pictures from the ground, an Army photographer was up about 1,000 feet in the plane taking the official pictures. The reason for this display of everything we had was that the high officials of the Air Service were on their way to visit the camp and check out on what we had and the shape it was in. Also, us troopers lined up in our very best and were part of the exhibit. A spliced film picture giving a long-range view of some of our barracks area. At this stage of the game, we also had water tanks, shower baths, and some of the other luxuries of a well-organized camp. Chris relaxing with not even a Frenchman to bark at, as St. Jean was the official U.S. aerial gunnery training center. All of the Americans had been taken out of Kazakh's Lake, leaving it as we found it, with a strictly French aerial gunnery training camp. This is intended to show the big group of Frenchwomen delivering the laundry. The beginning of the end. The armistice had been signed and the peace negotiations were underway. These two pictures show the 153rd Aero Squadron and supply trucks leaving Saint Jean de Mont on the first step of a long, happy journey to the land where the Statue of Liberty will welcome them back home. The early squadrons to reach France, like the 36th Aero Squadron, were made up entirely of volunteers. We started out as construction squadrons and built first-class airfields on what the year before had been farm, like Isodrone near Paris. Later on, when it became time to start sending boys home, in many cases, the draftees who had just arrived were the first to go. Apparently, their lack of training and experience in the work to be done made them easiest to be spared. So many of them were happily back home while we were still sogging around in the mud. To us, early volunteers, this did not seem quite right, but had it been called on to make the decision, we would have done the same. Typical French civilian cemeteries, the flowers and many decorations were made of colored beads strung on wire, nothing to wilt and made to last a long time. In many cases, the family lot is the size of a single grave. The first one to die was buried deep, and the others were buried successively above. Very efficient. After having too much liquid refreshment, some of our troops raided the cemeteries and ended up with beaded flowers or sentiments mounted to their bunks. Conveniences such as front urinals are more or less standard along the sidewalks and in the busy squares throughout the great deal of France. Seem to have found a necessity. Football game at Camp Montovie near Saint-Navarre. This 16-inch cannon in the car was tagged for shipment to West Point, USA. Pictures were taken in February 22nd, 1919, in a warehouse area and railroad yards near the docks of Saint-Nazaire. All this material is souvenirs of the war and is being prepared for shipment to America. Much of it has to be dismantled and crated before loaded on freight ships to the U.S. The 4 or 5-inch guns will no doubt end up in parks and city squares all over the USA. Eating facilities at Camp Montour were tremendous. The mess hall fed 12,000 soldiers 3 times a day. Washing our mess kits was a pleasure, as they had large tanks with hot soapy water and other tanks with hot plain rinsing water. Squadron 36 marching to the mess hall. A tiny corner of the docks in Saint-Nazaire Harbor. At the back of the picture are a couple of large troop ships of the SS Manchuria size. One of the locks through which the ships pass in going from the outer harbor to the inner harbor and vice versa. We were on the SS Manchuria going through the lock to the outer harbor. We were waving goodbyes to those at the dock who came to see us off. Saint-Nazaire in the distance. This was our last view of France, about 4 p.m., March 14th, 1919. Everybody's happy. We were traveling parallel to the big waves, which gave the ship quite a roll. Most all of the over 4,000 aboard were suffering some degree of seasickness. Many were down and out. I was almost there for a couple of days. Those leaning over the rail were not looking for fish, they were feeding them. Looking forward from the bridge, a few of the 4,000 men, and looking aft from the middle of the ship, a few more of the passengers. The decks should have been much larger to accommodate all of the troops. On most of the trip, the air was cold and foggy, but it smelled so good compared with the condition below deck. When everyone was below deck and in bed, it reminded one of how sardines are packed in a can. Some of the more somber deck scenes. Up forward is a large iron barred cage in which were kept those who had gone crazy from shell shock or fear. I often wondered if the folks at home knew what to expect. The draped boxes are coffins, and some of them were used on the way home. No one was permitted in the lifeboats or in the life rafts. The boys in this picture were taking advantage of the guard being out of sight for the moment. A few rolls of the ship later and he returned, and the lifeboat was deserted and the troopers were propped up against other parts of the ship. We surely missed the deck lounges and chairs that travel brochures show in their pictures of ocean travel. Everyone looking for something, the first sight of land. A bit of New York shorelines in the distance. There she is, right down to the last man. We pledged to the Statue of Liberty that from now on we would stay in behind her regardless of what happens in Europe. This is the boat that led us into the harbor and up to our dock, March 24th, 1919. Continuous roar of foghorns of all the ships in New York Harbor and the whistles of factories along the shore gave us a thrilling welcome. We saw more tears from the time the Statue of Liberty came in sight until we tied up to the dock than we saw all the time we were in France. No one was ashamed of the dirty streaks down his face. They hadn't changed a single building in the skyline of New York while we were away. The band started up as the Manchuria was tied up to dock. Camp Mills, near Hempstead, Long Island, which was my home for 3 months, where I was hospitalized with a session of mumps, after which I went through a surgery for hernia, a souvenir of the war that I had brought back with me. Discharged from the Army on June 23rd, 1919.